is a virus like a moon? They might seem to be totally different from each other, but when you look a little closer, they actually have a lot in common. They're both of a size and scale that we can really only access them if we have access to specialized equipment. And that equipment isn't the kind of thing you can just run in your basement, like a gene sequencer or a large robotic spacecraft. They're the kinds of things that can only be supported by institutions, organizations, laboratories, missions, etc. These kinds of long-term, well-funded, stable scientific collaborations that can occur over many, many years or decades. And finally, if we're talking about the moon Europa, which is currently in orbit around Jupiter and might have the conditions to support life outside of the Earth, then in fact it has quite a lot in common with the novel coronavirus, in that we just don't know very much about it. I'm Janet Vertesi. I'm a sociologist of science and technology and organizations at Princeton University, and I've just published a paper in the British Journal of Sociology that looks at what happens when we test under conditions of uncertainty. Uncertainty that at first seems like it's about the object we're testing, but in actual fact is also about the institutions and organizations that underlie that testing, that undergird our ability to test and to know anything at all. I make this case by looking at a study of the new missions that NASA is launching to go to Europa. This is a moon around Jupiter that may have the conditions that support life. It's an icy ocean world way out there in the outer solar system. And it will take hundreds of scientists and engineers many years of working together to decide what experiments to send, to build those experiments and to send it off into space, and finally to investigate the moon. But what I observed while I was watching these scientists in a very early stage of their investigation is they had a really funny way of talking about Europa. They called it uncooperative. And at first I thought, what a strange thing to say about a moon. As if a moon could cooperate. What is it supposed to cooperate with? How is it being uncooperative? And it turned out that in their way of talking, this identified all the ways in which this object was slippery, hard to control, hard to determine, required a lot of work on their part in order to ascertain its properties and its characteristics. What I also noticed, though, is that in my prior studies of other planetary missions, and I've been working with NASA for about 15 years now, I've studied several other mission teams, none of those other planets or moons were considered uncooperative. In fact, they already had a really robust set of institutions, organizations, lines of funding, even a robot that were already conducting those investigations. So really what it came down to was not just that we didn't know very much about Europa, and we wouldn't until we sent a spacecraft there, but we didn't know enough about our team. We didn't have funding for our institution. We didn't have institutional support. And under those conditions, the moon could only be seen to be uncooperative. We're actually seeing something very similar today with the discovery of the new novel coronavirus and COVID-19, and especially the attempts to assemble tests that will identify whether or not people have the coronavirus, whether or not we are carriers or transmitters silently or passively, whether or not we have had it and have the antibodies for it. Now, there's a lot of things that we know about coronaviruses. This isn't the first one we've encountered. In the same way that there's a lot of things that we know about moons and icy moons. Europa isn't the first one we visited. But the other element that's going on here is that these objects become even more unknowable and uncooperative in the face of institutional breakdowns. And what we're currently seeing with the coronavirus crisis is not just a lack of knowledge about a scientific object, but funding crises that have affected science for the last 10 years since the recession, people having to shut down their labs or work from home or work at a distance or work with social distancing in order to get the work done. In some places, the effort is led by a kind of centralized governmental attempt to understand and grasp the virus. Those places have been quite successful with testing, for example, South Korea. And in other places like the United States, with a much more federated system of healthcare services and of researchers, this effort is spread out across many different institutions and agencies. And so what we're seeing is that the uncertainties that we have about the coronavirus are multiplying in the face of the uncertainties that we have in our scientific institutions. And this doesn't just mean the crisis of lack of faith in experts, but it also means the status of funding, the status of the relationships between these institutions, whether or not there's any kind of stable support for investigation into testing about the coronavirus in the future. And so, to that end, a moon is actually quite a lot like a virus, in the sense that in the face of this kind of institutional and organizational uncertainty, they both become slippery, difficult to test, and uncooperative.